We are in Genesis 39 tonight. And it's not quite as R-rated as last week's lesson was. It's a PG-13 this time, maybe. So, moving in the right direction.
You just can't get rid of that sex, drugs, and rock and roll.
When people give it up, the Bible will quit talking about it. Genesis 39. We're going to start with looking at the first 6 verses. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight, and became his personal servant, and he made him overseer of his house, and all that he owned he put in his charge. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself, except with anything except the food which he ate. Okay. Any thoughts on the introduction here to chapter 39?
What started out to be a poor situation turned into a fairly decent one for Joseph anyway. I mean, slavery is not a very, it's not good, I guess. I don't know, I can't think of the word I want to use, but it would be to be taken and turned into slavery would be a little hard on your psyche, I think. And yet Joseph never forgot the Lord, and the Lord never forgot him. This is the way the story goes.
Okay. Sherry and Robin say hello. And hello to those lovely ladies. We saw the betrayal back in chapter 37, the brothers, and their initial idea was to kill Joseph for spouting off about his dreams. And Reuben intervenes briefly to save his life, and then before Reuben can deliver Joseph back to his father, Jacob, Judah and the rest of the brothers conspire to sell Joseph to some traveling Ishmaelites as a slave. The Ishmaelites have now moved him on down the line and sold him to a wealthy and powerful Egyptian. And we've talked about this. It's been a couple of weeks because last week was a really, in a sense, a very strong digression from the main storyline. There are some parallels, and we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But the story of Joseph is not so much about God acting miraculously. Yes, he guides Joseph and he allows Joseph to interpret the dreams. But really what happens with Joseph is within the realm of the possible. Maybe not likely. And when you add it all up, you look at it, well, this would never happen. But each step along the way, human beings make choices. They make choices that are available to them. And there are consequences to those choices, some good and some bad. And, there's none of this, the fleece is dry and the ground is wet, or the ground is dry and the fleece is wet. There's no parting of seas. There's no parting of rivers. There's no water in the wine in these stories. Really, there is kind of very gentle provision by God, in a sense, through Joseph's story. And we've seen miraculous stuff already. We've seen rams getting their horns caught in a thicket. We've seen, wrestling with angels. We've seen all kinds of stuff already. And this story is much more kind of down to there, is much more grounded. Wally and Thelma are here, and we're glad that they're both able to tune in tonight. Hope they continue to do well. Hi, Nell. Nell said, hello, Rick. So I said, hi to Nell. So that's kind of the nature of the story with Joseph, is things going well, at least for a while, within the realm of the possible, rather than overwhelming miraculous power of God being on display at every turn. There's not a barren woman giving birth when she's well past the age of childbearing. There's not that type of miraculous event going on here. This is, you get yourself into a bad situation, or other people place you in a bad situation. Sometimes you're able to make the best out of it, and it becomes what is potentially disastrous becomes potentially at least tolerable. It is really hard, I think, for anyone who has never been a slave to tell someone who is a slave, well, it's not that bad, is it? It's, what did Abraham Lincoln say? Those who defend slavery he'd like to see it tried out on them. How would they like it then? And so America has its own shameful history with the institution of slavery, and it had its own peculiar characteristics, its own basic nature. Slavery is something that evidently has pretty much always been in place around societies and civilizations. Wherever there are gatherings of people, some people are masters and some are slaves, it seems like. And we'd like to think now, we're the 21st century, we're so smart and we're so technologically savvy and everything, there is no slavery anymore in the world, and yet there is still very much. Even in America, there is slavery. We call it human trafficking now. And it's the first time I heard about it, I'd say the first time I heard about the whole concept of human trafficking, I didn't really know what it was. And we were, I guess I don't know how this story fits in with the whole thing or how well it fits, but I was working at a golf course in Auburn, Washington, and we hosted, it was kind of a high-end hoity-toity course, the kind I could never afford to play at on my own. So I had to work there to play at it sometimes. But they would have events there a lot. They rented the whole course out a lot for fundraisers or corporate events and things like this. And this was a fundraiser with the intention, and it may have been a corporate event too, with a specific theme of trying to help raise money to combat human trafficking. And I heard some woman give a little speech to all the players before they took off for their starting tee times and everything. And she's talking about all this, and I thought, she's just making all that stuff up. I've never heard anything about any of this stuff. And if I'd heard it a year later, it would have been much more impactful on me, because within that year, everything she said was confirmed from other sources that this is just really something that's happening all over our country, really, particularly in the large cities, the port cities, the points of ingress for legal and illegal immigrants. And a few years later, our government toppled the government of Libya several years ago. We helped and stood by and watched, and we saw, I should say, I don't remember exactly the events, how directly involved we were or weren't with Gaddafi's ouster, so I will retract that we did it. I don't remember. But Gaddafi was overthrown and treated savagely before he was killed. And of course, he had been savage towards a lot of other people along the way. But there is, I understand now, in Tripoli, which is the capital city of Libya, an open slave market going on right now. So slavery as a practice, as an institution, as an economic and human reality has been around forever, as long as there have been humans, evidently, and it persists until this day. We are deluding ourselves if we don't think it exists today. So it's hard to tell Joseph, see, it's not really that bad. I mean, you've risen up to this level, but he is still a slave, and he cannot leave. He cannot return to his father. He cannot return to his family, and he is not free to do whatever he wants. He is free to exercise kind of authority or dominion over someone else's wealth, and God has made it as good as it can be. Our objectionability to this setting may be ours. Maybe in the original audience, where some of the readers would be slave owners and some of the hearers would also be slaves, they would have a very different take on it. And the fact is, their slavery was, particularly within the nation of Israel, and as it pertained to Jews, was very different than our slavery. Their slavery was much more like indentured servitude, much more, you run up a bill you can't pay, you work it off. And, if you were a man after 6 years, that's it. And if your slavery, your time of servitude runs into the year of Jubilee, you're free then too. So they had their rules. Now for women, it was perpetual. A Jewish girl that was sold into slavery would be a slave the rest of her life. So there's just no real good way of doing slavery. I think I mentioned a couple of times, Sherry and I have taken a couple of cruises in the Caribbean and gone to the city, Belize City. And Belize was a British colony that had slavery for a really long time. They speak English, really thick Caribbean type accent, and it's very poor, very run down. It hasn't always been that poor and run down, but the Brits got all the money they could get out of Belize, and they left. It used to be called, I think, British Honduras was the term. Yeah, I've heard that term. And they left all the black folks, the descendants of the slaves they had brought over there, who were poorly educated and poorly trained to run the country. They left them to run the country. And the first time I saw it, it left me with this thought that I hadn't had before. And it's probably my simple-mindedness that made me not have it before. But one of the evils of slavery is there is no good way to get out of it. Once you start it, particularly the type that was experienced in the Americas, where you are bringing the slaves from across an ocean, inhumanely at that, and then they can't go back because it's lasted so long, there's no back to go to. That's not their home over there. And they've intermarried, and they don't have clear guidance as to where they're from originally and all that. So they get left this land that isn't theirs. The native people, the indigenous people, have been dispossessed and killed off and everything too. So they're in somebody else's land with no idea, no training, no money. All the money has been gone, has been taken. No means to really administer the country. And it's taken them a long time, and they still got a long way to go. And when people ask me about it, I tell them there's nothing wrong with Belize City that a few $1 trillion wouldn't fix. But that's it's not at all to be disparaging to the people of Belize, because they were left ignorant and impoverished by the actions of other people. So slavery is very evil. And to look at Joseph's situation and to say, as I do in the handout to someone, you can say God makes the best of a bad situation. If someone wanted to say there is no good situation in slavery, I think that's a hard point to argue against. I think that's, a valid concern, because even though he has power and authority and probably some privileges and some benefits, treated a little bit better, the work isn't quite as hard, clothed better, fed better, he may have access to female slaves. That was part of the provision of the Jewish form of slavery, was that the male slaves could be given female slaves. And the children that they may have produced belonged to the master. They weren't the slave's own children anymore. So Joseph may have, as far as it goes for a slave, had a very good situation. It's still slavery. And if you want to say there is no such thing as a good situation in slavery, I tend to agree with you. But God is working. God is credited for the improved status. Whatever benefits he experiences as Potiphar's number one slave are attributed to God. Now, to the people around Potiphar, the people seeing this, they may be thinking, look how wise and smart and compassionate Potiphar is. Look how generous he is as a slave owner, promoting this Hebrew to this great position of authority. The people of faith, to Joseph, to the early Israelites, this is God at work. God is doing this, not Potiphar. And I think that's really a better understanding of it. But he has this, 3 times in his life, he gets this status of being the number 1, number 2 guy, in a sense. The right-hand man to the one who really holds the power. And this is the first incident. He is the number 2 guy to Potiphar, but Potiphar just takes all of his thoughts, concerns, and worries, everything, all the responsibilities, and all the authority to administering his wealth, and just hands them off to Joseph. Potiphar becomes a foodie. All I think of, what am I going to eat? What's my food? What am I going to have for breakfast? What am I going to have for lunch? What am I going to have for dinner? These days, if Potiphar was in this situation, he would be YouTubing, every meal he ate. He would, we had these lovely quail eggs poached in this nice béarnaise sauce or whatever they do, however they do all that stuff. He would be blogging and maybe even get his own TV show eventually, talking about how wonderful he dines, how sumptuously he dines on every occasion. Or maybe he was worried about what he ate for his health, and maybe that was the thought. That's all he concerned himself, though, was with the food that he ate. And it turns out there was at least one other thing in his life that he needed to turn his attention to. And we'll see that in the next several verses. So let's read verses 7 through 20 of Genesis 39. It came about after these, we didn't really finish verse 6. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. Verse 7, it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" And she spoke to Joseph day after day. He did not listen to her to lie beside her or be with her. Now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. She caught him by his garment, saying, "Lie with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. When she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled outside, she called to the men of her household and said to them, "See, he has brought in a Hebrew to make us to make sport of us. He came into me to lie with me, and I screamed. When he heard that I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled and went outside." So she left his garment beside her until his master came home. Then she spoke to him with these words, "The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us, came into me to make sport of me. And as I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment beside me and fled outside. Now, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spoke to him, saying, "This is what your slave did to me," his anger burned. So Joseph's master took him and put him into the jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the jail. Okay. What do we think about that? She lied? She was a trifling woman, huh? The book of Proverbs presents to its readers kind of two types of women. One is the virtuous wife, which is the wisdom, which is the word of God. The other one is an adulterous wife. There is the conception of the prostitute to some extent, but the adulterous wife is the dominant bad girl, femme fatale, if you will. And maybe they were thinking about Potiphar's wife when they wrote all those proverbs, because that's what she's doing, and that's what's at stake here. Potiphar had it so good. All he had to do was worry about what he was going to eat. Any other thoughts on this? Does anybody know what the Billy Graham rule is?
Oh, never alone, the man is never alone with a woman. I think Vice President Pence did the same thing, didn't he?
They, some men, and I think you're right, I think Vice President Pence had tried to adopt basically the same rule. And this rule, as PD said, basically, as married men in particular, but I guess in this day and age, it wouldn't matter if you were married or not, you didn't want to be alone with a woman, because the appearances, for one thing, and then it becomes simply a matter of he said, she said on that. I think in our day and age, I don't know that you could just limit it to a woman. You can't be alone with a woman. Workers, it's, it could be a problem from the other direction as well. What's that, Alma? If you're going to mutter, you got to speak up.
I said, men have a wandering eye too.
Yes.
Not only the women, the men too.
Why didn't Joseph employ that rule? Well, he was a slave too, right? I mean, he is under Potiphar, but he can't tell the wife what to do. He can't tell the mistress of the house what to do. He told her what he wouldn't do. He resisted these commands, and you see this kind of evolution. When someone commands you to do something and you don't do it, eventually that commandment becomes an accusation one way or another. I mean, she accuses him of trying to do the very thing she wanted him to do, but in a context that would have been life-threatening. And at the same time, this is, again, the evil of slavery. If Joseph had just said, well, I'm going to do it just to shut her up, that's life-threatening too, isn't it? What happens if that's discovered? It's not like he can just placate her and move on. So it's a very difficult situation, and tying it kind of back into the Billy Graham rule is it's really, in so many settings, it's not really possible. At some time, if you're a male boss and you have female employees, you may have to be alone with your female employee. If you're a female boss and have male employees, you may need to be alone with your male employees. There's just things in work context in a professional context where you can't always have a bunch of witnesses. You can't always shield yourself. You can't always protect yourself. I think it's kind of got basically a good premise behind it, but in application, for most people, it's not particularly realistic. And that leaves people vulnerable. There's no doubt about it. You can't. It is a reflection of Billy Graham's power, in a sense, the power that he had to be able to implement that rule, that he can have someone there with him at all times. He has authority over that. But at the same time, I know a lot of us are still not perhaps real comfortable with women having careers or whatever. But if a male employee could go to his boss, who's another man, and be alone with him and spend time, go hunting with him, play golf with him, go fishing with him, I mean, is that going to help his career? Probably. At least has the potential to, doesn't it? That's an advantage that he has that a female employee may not have. She can't be alone with him because she's female. The problem is not so much that they're male and female. The problem is there's a desire, an ungodly desire, not just sexually, but a desire to exploit the power that she has over him. And she represents not so much just trifling women, but she represents what the powerful do to the vulnerable. Joseph, as good as he has it, he's still vulnerable. He still can't control where he's at and what he does all the time and who he's with all the time. And she has more power than him in the relationship. And she attempts to exploit that power for something she at least thinks she wants. And we'll go ahead and say she wants it, because that's fair with the text, I think. She attempts to exploit it. This is in stark contrast, of course, to the previous chapter, chapter 38, where you have the story of Judah and Tamar. My outline notes have a little bit more of a discussion on that than we'll get into tonight. But in both cases, a man withholds sex from a woman. Judah withholds his youngest son, Shelah, from Tamar. Joseph is withholding himself from Potiphar's wife. In both cases, the women deceive men. Tamar deceives Judah. Potiphar's wife deceives Potiphar. In the two cases, Tamar and Judah actually have extramarital sex. Tamar obtains extramarital sex by deception. And at the end of the story, she's the righteous one. In this story, nobody has sex. And yet Joseph ends up in prison. We like to have these clear, bright line, black and white rules. We like to have, this is what you do and this is what you don't do. And we'll just apply our life to the right side of these things. We'll do the do's and we'll avoid the don'ts, and here we go. The problem is that doesn't really match up too well with the realities of human existence. And the Bible is full of stories in the gray. I mean, you can look at what Tamar did and find commandments and say, she lied, she, whatever, this, that, and the other. But at the end of the story, the Bible says she's the righteous one. She's the good girl. Here, they don't ever even have sex. And the righteous one goes to prison. He does everything right and ends up in prison. There's an inability to see the gray in life, to see that human beings are a mixture of good and bad, that at times they do what they should and at times they do what they shouldn't. And to cope with that, it shows, first of all, that you don't realize how much in the gray you are. That you too do things you should do and don't do things you should, and do things you shouldn't do, and vice versa. You don't do what you should do sometimes as well. So we're all in the gray somewhere. And to look at who is grayer than who is kind of, in a sense, it's ultimately God's decision, isn't he? God can look at these very broken human realities, consider all the factors, things beyond our knowledge, our ability to acquire the knowledge, and make a righteous judgment. There was a famous TV news person. The Catholic Church, I guess, earlier this week announced that it would still continue the practice of not blessing gay homosexual unions. And this TV commentator said, God doesn't judge, God doesn't hinder people. And I guess maybe, I don't know exactly which God he's talking about in that context. It's not the God of the Bible, because the God of the Bible is the righteous judge. He does judge. And God tries really hard at times to hinder people from doing the wrong thing. But when we get down, when we're judging others, and when we're trying to make these discernments, and when we're trying to follow these, what we think are clear, crisp, bright line rules, and apply those to everyone else, we are putting ourselves up where God alone belongs. You read the facts of these two stories. If I took the names and the context out and I just took events, this happened and this happened and this happened and this happened. Which one would you say had a happy ending? And if I just talked about the women, I'd say, which woman is righteous? And you'd probably say neither one, but one is. Tamar was going after her marital rights. She was a widow entitled to sexual access to the brother of her dead husband. She didn't get that. She got something even better, which was a child by her father-in-law, which elevated. And that first child born is the child of the dead husband. So he's the prominent heir. Tamar never has kids. Shelah is the primary heir. Well, Tamar's firstborn is the son of the oldest brother. He's now the primary heir. So what she did, dressing up like a prostitute, putting herself out for it as a prostitute, taking the pledge of compensation for the encounter, that's her working out her own salvation. That's the way of her acquiring what God intended her to have anyway. What Potiphar's wife is doing is trying to have something she's not entitled to. She's got a husband. If all he wants to do is sit around and eat all the time, well, she should probably talk to Sherry sometime about it and feel, that she could commiserate with him. But, that's her problem. And yes, she has the earthly power to reach out and put her hand on a male slave. But when that male slave is the chosen man of God, acting in confidence and faith and trust in God, all she's going to do is take his robe off. She can touch him, but she can't grasp him. She can't have him. At a real big cost for him. He gets kind of the button gets reset again. He's in prison this time again. If there's anything worse than slavery, maybe it's prison. I don't know which is worse. They're both bad. Probably depends on who's the slave master and who's the warden at the prison. Again, Joseph, and we probably won't read it, but the last few verses, verses 21 through 23, Joseph goes to jail, gets elevated. He's the number one trustee in the prison right away. And the warden is like, I don't have to even run the prison anymore. I let this prisoner run. We have an inmate running the prison. A bad situation made as good as it can be. Still, he's a prisoner. He was a slave and now he's a prisoner. So is it good? Yes, sir.
Yes, it's good for one reason. States in there. God was with them. God was with them when he was enough to go for the master of the house. God was with them when he was in the service. And so there's no question when you read the story, God was with them and continues to be with them. Now, what the woman did, caused it to the person that 2,000 years ago.
I'm having a little hard time understanding. I'm sure everybody listening on the computer, so I'm going to sum it up. But the chapter begins and ends with assurances that God is with and acting on behalf of Joseph. In between, we have this kind of salacious narrative.
That's a mankind event, which is not good. But you have God throughout the whole thing, and God is with them.
God.
Well, in that sense, is what I'm saying, it's good.
Mhm.
It's good because he does not lose God. God is with him.
And God is with him in a way maybe to open the eyes of the people. I mean, how many people labor at a job and do a great job and they go unnoticed? I mean, that happens all the time, doesn't it?
And Potiphar, that's what we're also told. Potiphar saw that it was God. Don't ask me how he did that, because I don't think Potiphar was a godly man. But yet, he was enough of a person to see that God was with him, was with him.
He may be God using Potiphar's vice of laziness to Joseph's benefit. I don't want to take care of all this stuff. I don't even want to take care of my wife, And I'm not saying it's his fault that his wife was stepping out on him. I mean, I don't know. We don't know that story, but and we don't. But we have this sandwich in which the two pieces of bread are God is with you while you are enduring hard times. Not while you're walking onto your brand new Gulfstream G700 $75 million private jet. Okay. I mean, when you're walking on, I saw a little video about that jet. If you can get one, that's the only way to fly. When you're stepping up in your custom-made suit from London, Savile Road, and everything's going on. You got all the finest delicacies awaiting you when you get on the plane, and you're going to fly in absolute comfort to the most beautiful, exotic location in the world. Hopefully, if that happens to you, you can say, God is with me. God has given me this. God may say to you, you should be sharing a little bit more before all this happens, but maybe not. I'm not getting into all that, I guess. But God is with Joseph in slavery. God is with Joseph in prison. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the right paths take you through the valley of the shadow of death. There's not an absence of evil, but we do not fear evil. Why? Because he is with us. There are people right there where PD works. There's people up there right now that God is with them. What can separate us from the love of God? Prison bars cannot separate you from the love of God. It can make the presence of God hard to discern. And God may not move in our big corporate world where everything's corporate anymore. He may not move. And you may work at a factory and do a great job, really be the best employee and everything, and see the slack off guy that works right next to you who you have to carry. You may see him get all the promotions and go straight up the chain, and one day he's your boss. mean, there's no guarantee that God is going to elevate you the way Joseph has been elevated, but God is at work. Joseph is God's chosen man, and Joseph doesn't even know why yet. Joseph can't possibly imagine why yet. But adverse circumstances do not reflect an absence of God's provision in your life, your ability to get through those adverse circumstances.
Well, Job would be an example of that. Job didn't do anything wrong, had all that happen to him, but he never lost faith that God was with him and God was going to take care of him somehow, some way. And
Well,
he did.
and Job doesn't understand either. And, I've had people, when I've talked about Job, I don't talk Job. Job is very extreme. Even he loses everything. I mean, health, wife, kids, everything. The absolute most essential component of the story of Job is that he is without blame, is that he consider my servant Job how righteous he is. If he has done anything to bring that on, the story falls apart. And I've heard so many people in the church context say, well, there must have been something Job did. And as soon as you say that, you sound like his friends, not Job. That's who you're identifying with, the friends that try to lead him astray, in comforting him, but lead him astray. Now, most of the time when we end up there, or we have other problems in our life, we can look back and say, I made really poor choices. I did really bad things. I brought this on myself. You smoke 10 packs of cigarettes a day, and when you're 60 years old, they tell you got lung cancer, you can say, maybe my smoking contributed to that. Maybe you would have got, there's a lot of people with lung cancer that never smoked a cigarette. I knew a wonderful Christian lady who never took a drink, got liver cancer and died from it. But our circumstances, however they come about, do not have to separate us from God. Even through our own poor choices, God is standing there to be with us. Nothing can separate us from the love of God. Only our refusal to be with God. Only when we turn and do not want his presence in our life. I don't believe that once you're saved, you can never forfeit your salvation. I believe you can. You can turn your back on God and go and never come back. It's a possibility. But when you are saved, God has come into your life and you've let God into your life, and what happens to you may be your own fault at times. You may do other things that bring these things on you, but God still loves you. You're still his child. You may go to prison. You may be on death row. Jesus knows something about being on death row, doesn't he? Jesus knows something about getting railroaded in court, doesn't he? Before there were railroads, he got railroaded in court. I mean, this is the God we serve. He is not afraid. He can go into the palace of Pharaoh and boom, your oldest son's dead. But he can also go into prison and find a prisoner, a lowly foreigner in prison. Just imagine that. Which country, if you had to go to prison, which country would you want to go to prison in? Outside of the United States. Maybe Canada, but I've heard some folks that have spent time in Canadian prisons, and it was no piece of cake. They said we really don't like foreigners. Don't bring a loaded gun into Canada. That's the lesson to be learned there. If you're an American, you're not allowed to bring loaded guns there without a lot of permissions. Don't just show up with one. So we cannot isolate ourselves from God unless we choose to be isolated from God. And we turn our back on him. Eventually, we miss out. But mistakes, failures, sin, if it's repented of, if it's confessed, if it's, God is always waiting to be there and willing to endure whatever horrible circumstances we find ourselves. There are people going to go to sleep on the street tonight that God is right there with them. His people may not be with them the way they should be. I mean, that's a fair question to ask. But God is with them. And we can't, I'm not trying to make you all feel guilty. Nobody can do everything. No congregation can do everything. You know, but we look at circumstances. One of my favorite movies is The African Queen, which was Humphrey Bogart and Kathleen Hepburn. And Bogey refers to the place they're in there. They're getting eaten alive by mosquitoes and all. They're having a really miserable experience there for a while. And he refers to it as a God-forsaken place. And Katharine Hepburn says, God has not forsaken this place. My brother, who was a missionary from England, my brother is here. God has not forsaken this place. Now that's also, in our current cultural culture, just when you start reimagining old movies or old stories or anything like that, you put them into our current culture, they start being very problematic. Even that idea that all the Africans needed a white missionary from England to come tell them how to be what God wanted them to be. You know, the country that had enslaved them originally is now coming to tell them how they should believe in God. But that's, again, different matter. But God has not. The beginning and the ending of this chapter are very theological, and it is finding God in difficult circumstances. And if you can't find God in difficult circumstances, you're going to have a really hard time in life because you're going to encounter difficult circumstances. And in between, we have this little lurid tale of a trifling woman bringing down a good, honest man. And this story is a little bit troubling because, you know, we live in a culture where when it's our guy that's accused of doing something wrong with a lady, we usually try to attack the lady. That's our response. But they're in it for some gain of their own, for some reason of their own. And, you know, when it's our guy, we stick up for him. And when it's the other side's guy, we want to drag him all the way down off the pinnacle he's sitting on. And that's when this Me Too movement got started. I told some folks at the time, if you think this is going to ruin one political party and not the other, you are crazy. Because the powerful men on both sides are powerful men. And they will be brought down. But this story is about a powerful woman. So the false accusation, there's always this remote possibility that it's true because we know, at least in one case, it was true. And there maybe have been other occasions too. But I really don't think women lie about that sort of thing very often. It just doesn't make them look too good, usually. And their whole conduct and their whole history and everything else comes up as soon as they make the act. I'll never wonder again why they don't come forward sooner. The way some of these things have gone out the last 10 years. You know why they don't come forward. It doesn't a lot of time do any good. Nobody believes them. Their whole family gets raked over the coals. It's just easier to let it go most of the time. And I'm sorry for them. I'm sorry that that's the truth sometimes for them, or their determination. So. Okay. Well, I kept you over, and I'm sorry about that. Mr. Kelso, will you lead us in a closing prayer? We've been over there quiet all afternoon. So.
Heavenly Father, we're so grateful for